Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. Community Solar in Maine, clean energy for all. Once upon a time, the only real way to opt into renewable energy was to install solar panels on your own roof. But Maine people have many more options these days, from coordinating our own community solar farms to signing up for community solar subscriptions. Those myriad offers can be pretty overwhelming. Many of you have reached out for guidance on sorting through those postcards you're getting in the mail. And we are delighted today to have Maine's public advocate, Bill Harwood, with us to share more about what we should know about community solar subscriptions, what makes community solar a worthwhile investment for a family interested in climate action, and what questions you should be asking. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speaker first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of those and ask them in the Q&A at the end. We ask that you not message speakers directly as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous programs. Thank you again for joining us, and Advocate Harwood, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to Maine Conservation Voters for this opportunity. I'm pleased to be with all of you today, talking about community solar, than the usual amount of controversy over the last few years. And I want to take a few minutes to see if we can unpack what the benefits and the challenges of this program. So, are you still good? Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. So let me start by saying about the community solar program, there have been some out there who have been looking for the villain, if there is a villain for this program. I don't think there are any villains. I think that this has been one of those programs where many, many people have participated in good faith. The legislature trying hard to get as much renewable energy as we can, but trying to do it on a cost-effective basis. And the solar industry responding to those incentives has done its part by promoting this program. But having said that, there is a question of cost. And of course, that's where my office as the public advocate representing ratepayers has our primary focus. So I want to just be clear that while there is some criticism of this program, it is not directed at any one group or individuals. It is one that we collectively need to continue to work on and improve. So a couple of basics about where we are with this program. We have today over 750 solar projects under development under the community solar or the net energy billing. That's a lot of projects for a state like Maine. those projects represent more than 1,500 megawatts of capacity. That's a lot of capacity. That's a lot of energy for Maine. To put it into context, that's bigger than the old Maine Yankee nuclear power plant, bigger than the Wyman 4 oil plant in Yarmouth, bigger than both of them combined. In fact, it's bigger than the largest generating station in New England, the Seabrook nuclear power plant in Seabrook, New Hampshire. So that's a lot of power. Some have said that if at the maximum demand that the CMP ratepayers put on the CMP system, if all of those projects were developed and were operating and the sun was shining, they alone could meet the demand of CMP's total load. So we're talking about a lot of power, a lot of projects under development. We don't know whether all of them will be built. Certainly some of them will fall by the wayside, but that's a big question. So the good news is the solar industry responded very aggressively to the incentive and has made a huge dent in helping us meet our goals for climate change. The problem is the upward pressure on rates, and that's where the controversy has come in. The basic problem, to slightly oversimplify it, is that the cost per kilowatt hour that the utilities are buying this energy from the solar developers is way above market price. To put it in simple terms, today they are, for those early projects that are online, the utilities are paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour or more. 20 cents a kilowatt hour or more. That's a lot to buy energy on the wholesale market. And what makes it particularly problematic is that through competitive bidding, we know that utilities can buy the same solar power, the same solar energy on the wholesale market at about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So the question for the policymakers is, why would we ask the utilities and their ratepayers to be paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour for solar energy when we can get it for 5 cents a kilowatt hour on the wholesale market through competitive bidding? And that has been the controversy as to how to balance the success of the program in promoting solar with the upward pressure on CMP and Versant's delivery rates to essentially subsidize those projects. What's particularly troubling for some of us is that this has echoes of some of past programs that were not so successful. And for some of us who've been around for a while, we may remember the days of President Jimmy Carter, the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s. It was similar to some of what's going on with climate change. It was a national crisis, a national emergency to respond to the stranglehold that the oil producers in the Middle East had on us in the 1970s. The legislature responded with PURPA, a legislative program that required utilities to pay a cost for renewable energy that was set in the legislation, not by the market and not by the regulatory agencies, FERC or the PUC. The program turned out to be a big failure in terms of cost. The avoided cost was essentially requiring the utilities to take their most expensive generator and figure out that cost and then offer it to any renewable project that wanted to sign up. What it did is it had upward pressure on rates, and we finally had to phase out the program, although there have been still some contracts that are still in the tail end that came out of that PURPA. The analogy is that in this case with community solar and PURPA, we had the legislature, not the market and not the regulator, the legislature setting the price, and it was the utility required to pay this above market price to stimulate renewables. And that is a lesson that should be learned from this. And unfortunately, the lesson learned from PURPA has been lost in the last couple of years as we have looked at the community solar program. So the question is, what can we do going forward? Well, the good news is that the legislature is trying to focus on this and to fix it. In 2021, we had a corrective amendments offered to essentially require some of these projects to meet certain milestones or lose their status in the under the program, lose the subsidy. And that we still are trying to figure out exactly how many projects fell by the wayside, but we know that a certain number, and that while it may reduce the amount of benefit on climate change, will reduce the cost. In this session that just ended this spring, the legislature took another look at it, and in this case said to certain solar projects that if you are far enough along in your development, you get the full subsidy. But if you are not far enough along in your development, you will get a reduced subsidy that is set something below the retail prices. And so this 20 cent per kilowatt hour that I mentioned earlier would not be increasing at the rate that we now expect. We are looking at some very high natural gas prices coming up this next winter. Electricity prices will increase again, unfortunately. And one of the parts that is so troubling about that is it will increase the amount the utilities are required to pay to the solar developers as they come online. And if we can't get the natural gas prices under control, that will continue. And instead of 20 cents a kilowatt hour, we'll be looking at 25 cents or even 30 cents a kilowatt hour that the utilities are paying for these solar developers. That will create a lot of cost. Right now, the participating ratepayers who are sharing in the subsidy are going to be fine. They are protected because of their participation in the program. They have an offset to the increase. But for those ratepayers who are not participating in the program, and there are preliminary estimates that more than 95% of the electric ratepayers in the state are not participating in the program, there are reliable estimates out there that they could see their rates go up as much as 30%, a 30% increase over what they would be if we didn't have the community solar program. Once these projects are online, assuming most of them are developed and in operation, we may be seeing under the full subsidy program as much as a 30% increase. Hopefully the legislation in the last session, the 2022, will reduce that to something more manageable. But we are looking at substantial upward pressure on rates as a result of this program. So next slide, please. So one of the obvious questions is, this is a community solar program. What do we mean when we call it a community solar program? I think for most people, community feels like your neighborhood down the street, your community school, your community post office. It has a neighborhood feel to it. And if we go back and look at the original origin of net energy billing, and it's worth remembering that net energy billing was around long before the 2019 legislation or the more recent legislation. Under the original net energy billing that had been around for decades, it was incorporated in PUC Chapter 313. And in that case, the net energy billing had to be on the ratepayer's property. It was a very sleepy program, didn't get a lot of attention, didn't get a lot of controversy. It was mostly a farmer who had a wind turbine in the back 40. Maybe there was a small river running through the farm where they put a hydroelectric facility. And from time to time, there was some surplus generation that could be sold back to the utility, and they would sell it back at the full retail price. But it was so small and there were so few of them that it wasn't a significant issue in terms of upward pressure on rates. Then comes the 2019 legislation, which brought this explosion of activity. And in that case, They said it doesn't need to be on the ratepayer's property. It doesn't need to be in the back 40. In fact, it can be anywhere in the utility service area. Anywhere in the utility service area. So for me sitting in Yarmouth, Maine, I can participate in a project that is in Jackman, Maine, hundreds of miles away. It created a huge expansion of the project. What it did is it created the fiction that a solar project in Jackman, Maine is being treated as if it's on the roof of my suburban home in Yarmouth, Maine, which of course it isn't. And that creates the expansion in the program that led to the explosion of development under the program. So we've taken this concept of community and stretched it to the limit, particularly in the CMP, but even in the Versant territory, which covers so much of northern and eastern Maine. The good news is that we are starting to see the legislature take another look at that. And in the legislation that was just passed this session, the Chapter 659, there is a qualifier to get the full subsidy. Remember, I said that they had cut so that certain projects that were not as far along wouldn't get the full subsidy, they would get a partial subsidy. One of the criteria that gets you the full subsidy is if the project is co-located on the property of ratepayers who represent 50% of the subscribers or the subscription capacity of that project. So if a group of neighbors if a single ratepayer owns 50% of the subscription to that project, and the project is co-located on that ratepayer's property, then it qualifies. Now we're getting back to the original Chapter 313 and that 5 megawatt project in Jackman that's deemed to be on the roof of my house in Yarmouth is a little less. We now look to see whether it is co-located on the property or participating ratepayers. So that is another area which I suspect the legislature will look at again. And as we tweak and fine-tune the program, some have called it the DG 2.0, we may be looking at truly community or neighborhood projects. One suggestion has been made that they should be projects that are within a limited distance, maybe a mile or two, of all of the participating ratepayers. The idea being that if a group of neighbors wanted to get together and there was some room on one of the property or a vacant lot, they could have a true community or neighborhood project. But the idea that, you know, anyone can be a participating ratepayer and share in the subsidy of a project that's 100 miles from their home or business, it may have to be rethought. So that's an issue of community. Next slide, please. So the other is the size limit. If we go back to the original net energy billing, and remember I said it was in Chapter 313, it was limited to 850 kilowatts, not megawatts, kilowatts, less than 1 megawatt. This was truly the farmer's backed wind turbine or hydro project in the back 40. It was not very large. In fact, there were from time to time people who had projects that were bigger than 850 who tried to have that amended or changed, but it remained at 850 until the 2019 legislature, in which we had this explosion, and they took it from 850 kilowatts to 5 megawatts. That is more than 5 times increase. A 5 megawatt generating facility is not your mom and pop's hydro plant in the back 40 or the windmill in the back 40. It is a substantial generator. And so the question has been, can we have this large a subsidy available for projects of that size? And 5 megawatts, I think in hindsight, has been shown to be a larger size than we needed to make this project successful. And we're starting to see the legislature revisit that. In the 2021 legislation that I mentioned earlier, in which they said certain projects needed to meet certain milestones to maintain their status, they had a grandfather for any project that was 2 megawatts or less, or under 2 megawatts. That was the legislature recognizing that the small projects, the under 2 megawatt projects, are not as big an issue when it comes to the upward pressure on rates as those projects that are 3, 4, or 5 megawatts. And so there they were starting to pull back and say that if you have a project that's under 2 megawatts, you can retain the full subsidy and develop it at your normal pace. But for those projects between 2 and 5 megawatts, unless you meet these new milestones, you will lose your status and your subsidy in the project. And here again, in this last spring, the legislature took a look at the amount of the subsidy and decided that for certain projects, there would be a smaller subsidy. Again, the projects that didn't meet milestones, but they also said, if your project is under 1 megawatt or less, you get the full subsidy without meeting those milestones. Again, the legislature looking at the size issue and saying, we're okay with 1 megawatt. Those folks are not the big problem. It's the ones that are in the 2, 3, 4 megawatts. So you can see we've almost gone full circle from starting at 850 kilowatts or just below a megawatt. And now the legislature is beginning to toy with maybe the 1 megawatt projects are the ones that we should give the most protection to and the most encouragement, and make it slightly more difficult and more challenging for those larger projects. So this is something that will be revisited again, along with the community. We could end up with a program that going forward looks at projects that are, say, within 1 mile of all the participating ratepayers and less than 1 megawatt. You could have a 1 mile, 1 megawatt project requirement that would essentially be the new criteria that would limit the amount of involvement and the upward pressure on rates. So those are some of the issues that the legislature has been wrestling with and will continue to wrestle with as they try and balance the desire to have a robust renewable energy program, but not one that creates quite so much upward pressure on rates. Next slide. So one of the questions that we get, and I think that may have, as Kathleen said, are getting regularly invited through their mail to join these projects. And I think someone recently estimated there may be as much as 30,000 people in the state who are participating in these projects, which seems like a big number, but when you look at all the ratepayers as a whole, it's a relatively small percentage. So when we get these questions about participating ratepayers, a number of issues come up about what are the protections, what are the rules, how is this going to play out? And one of the things we're starting to be concerned about is the projects are just starting to come online in a significant amount. We will see over the next 12 to 24 months a huge movement to a lot of these projects becoming operational. And at that point, and only at that point, do the participating ratepayers then participate in the financial benefits of the project. So a couple of issues that have created some concern. You may see in the marketing materials that show up in your mailbox references to guaranteed savings, a guaranteed saving on your CMP bill of 15%, guaranteed savings. And that, I think, could be problematic because the guarantee is not guaranteed. It is only there depending on A, whether the project is actually built that you sign up for, and B, what your usage is. And so this guarantee of savings may turn out to be a controversial item. And I think the solar developers, some of the marketers for the solar projects, may be pushing that envelope a little bit far when they guarantee savings to ratepayers. The other issue which is related to this guarantee is the expiring credits. It's not well understood, but an important part of this program is that the bill credits, which is how the utility pays the solar developer, they provide the bill credits to the participating ratepayer, and then the participating ratepayer takes his or her share of the subsidy for themselves and sends the rest of the subsidy on to the solar developer. But the credits must be used by the ratepayer within 12 months. If those credits stay on your CMP or Versant bill for more than 12 months, they are worthless to the ratepayer. They expire. And we're already seeing ratepayers who are upset by that. Their view is, wait a minute, those are credits that are on my bill. I own those credits. I filled out the paperwork for those credits. Those credits belong to me, and CMP and Versant shouldn't have the right to arbitrarily take them away just because I couldn't use them in the 12 months. This is an important piece that participating ratepayers need to understand. It becomes really important if you imagine that that hypothetical ratepayer maybe spends 3 or 4 months of the year in Florida in the winter, or maybe has a seasonal home that they move to in the summer. If those credits are piling up on their CMP Versant bill at their primary residence and the usage is very low, then those credits remain on the bill and are not used, but at the end of 12 months, they're lost. And to be clear, even though the credits are worthless to the ratepayer still owes the solar developer its share of the subsidy. So if you have an 85-15 split where the ratepayer gets 15% of the subsidy and the solar developer gets 85%, those credits that expire provide no value to the ratepayer. They get zero, but they still owe the solar developer 85% of those value of those credits when they first hit the ratepayer's bill. If you think about it for a minute, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to envision a situation in which my hypothetical ratepayer goes to Florida for the winter or goes to the shore or the lake for the summer, that in fact that ratepayer could, in theory, be worse off by participating in the net energy billing program than if they had not participated at all. Obviously, if that becomes a common story in the next 2 or 3 years, we all are going to be hearing from those ratepayers, the utilities, the solar industry, the PUC, and my office, the public advocate, and there's going to be a lot of unhappy folks who feel that they did not understand the program. Related to this is we're starting to see the early signs of some billing issues. And this is the complication of having a three-way system. You've got CMP, the T&D utility that is involved in the billing. You've got the participating ratepayer and the solar developer. It is not an easy to make sure that those programs and that billing works out exactly right. We are beginning to see some early signs. What if the ratepayer is a low-income ratepayer and is participating in a low-income discount program? Does the credit then become less valuable, and how does that affect the solar developer? What if the ratepayer is in a special rate class? Versant, for example, has a special residential rate class for electric space heat. If that is an electric space heat customer, it's really important that the solar developer understand that and understand how the bill credits on that particular ratepayer work. we're already hearing from some solar developers who want the utility to help it be more opaque and more transparent about billing. And one of the things they've asked for is for the utilities to convert a kilowatt hour credit into a cash value, into a monetary value, because of course the solar developer isn't interested in receiving kilowatt hour credits. They want cash. And so that transfer from kilowatt hour credits on a bill to the cash that is then owed by the ratepayer to the solar developer become very important. And that's an issue that I think we're going to see more of as more solar projects come online. I also worry about the inevitable disputes. There are going to be misunderstandings. There are going to be uncertainties. There are going to be disputes between solar developers and ratepayers. It's important to remember that the contract between the solar developer and the ratepayer is a private contract between two private parties. It has not been drafted by the PUC or by the legislature. It is not something that the legislature, the PUC, prepared as a sample form to be entered into. It is a private contract, which as a lawyer, one immediately asks, well, where do the disputes go? The ones that I have seen have an arbitration clause. The ratepayers may assume that they can go to the Public Utilities Commission and get a resolution of any dispute they're having with the solar developer over that subsidy and how it's shared and what the developer may or may not have promised to the ratepayer. It is not yet clear to me whether the PUC would ever take jurisdiction over those disputes, whether the arbitration clause will be respected, or whether they may end up in Superior Court. It is an important issue, and for unsophisticated ratepayers who may not be adept at forum shopping for a favorable forum for dispute resolution, it's an important issue that all of us need to be paying attention to. Before I open it up to questions, I will just tell you the advice our office gives to those people who call saying, should I or shouldn't I? I've gotten this fancy brochure in the mail. I don't know whether to sign up or not. We say, absolutely, look into it. It can be a savings for you. 4 things that we suggest to them. 1, make sure you're dealing with a reputable developer. Make sure that the project that they're selling you is done by someone who hopefully has developed and brought online other solar projects. A developer that has a track record and history of successfully developing solar project is a much better bet, because remember, you're going to sit there and wait for the whole development and construction period for a year or 2 before you see the benefits. If that developer decides that project is never going to be developed for whatever reason, zoning, environmental, financing, you haven't got anything to show for it. So a good reputable developer, correctly size the amount of your participation to match the usage. This goes back to the Florida winter condo or the summer home at the lake. You don't want those credits to expire at the end of 12 months. It's important that you not bite off more than you can chew here. Correctly size your participation to match your usage. A good developer will help you do that. Read the fine print of the contract. Each developer has their own contract, and there's a lot of fine print in there. You should ask questions and you should understand it before you sign it. And finally, the pricing. We hear casual references that most of them are done on an 85-15 split. The developer gets 85% of the subsidy and the ratepayer gets 15%. That is not required by statute or rule or the PUC. That is to be negotiated. We understand that a lot of the solar developers are very anxious to have more participating ratepayers. That's certainly borne out by the number that show up in all our mailboxes every week. So use that leverage. If you are going to be a participating ratepayer, see if you can get a better split that will provide even more benefit and savings to you. So those are some of my thoughts and some of the issues we're watching in our office and some of the advice that we've given both to solar developers and ratepayers. And I'm happy to pause there and take whatever questions there may be.
Oof, you gave us a lot to think about. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you walking us through the progression of the policy and the way those policy changes over the last several years have impacted the solar market and the rates that we pay. So before we dive into to all of the questions, and there are a bunch, and folks can keep those coming to me in the chat. Before we do that, though, I want to make sure I'm understanding it. The original version of community solar pre-2019 was small, less than a megawatt, had to be on your property or one
on your property. No,
on your property.
On your property.
Okay. And so some of those constraints.
It was really just mostly for folks like farmers who had a certain amount of need for electricity and an outbuilding, a farm or whatnot. And from time to time, they had a little surplus electricity, and it was fine to have a two-way system and feed it back into the system. And CMP would give them credit on their bill for whatever surplus electricity they fed back into the system. There were very few of them, and there were very little controversy and very few issues ever made it to the PUC to resolve them.
Okay. And so some of those constraints, the system worked really, so it worked from the ratepayer perspective, but it really limited the consumer options and the solar market.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then 2019, we said, let's get rid of those arbitrary constraints and said it can be much bigger, right? More than 5 times the size. It can be anywhere. And
exactly.
And so that worked from the ease of participating for consumers, and it works for the encouraging the solar market, but doesn't work so well in terms of ratepayers.
Exactly, Kathleen. You said it this as succinctly as possible.
And is that the explanation behind that discrepancy that you talked about with the 20-cent rate versus 5 cents elsewhere?
Yeah, let me see if I can explain that. If you think about the way the concept works is you get paid for the power at the same price that you pay CMP. So if you think about basic economics, if you took freshman economics, you will understand that if you buy in the wholesale market at a high price and turn around and sell into the retail price market at a low price, you're going to go broke. You're going to go bankrupt. So essentially what the utilities are doing is they're buying power on the wholesale market for 20 cents because that's the current retail price of electricity. They turn around and dump it into the wholesale market for 5 cents because that's what solar energy is worth on the wholesale market. That 15-cent loss is what is the subsidy that is keeping these projects growing.
Okay. And then in order to not go broke, they have to recoup that cost.
Well, they get the cost from the ratepayers. It's built into their delivery rate. So when you see your CMP rate, it has this. Now, to be fair, the subsidy has barely shown up in the rates because the 2019 legislation hasn't yet resulted in these projects. A handful of them, a few of them are starting to come online. We're starting to see the early signs of it, but this rate impact will not be felt for another year or two.
Okay. There are lots of great questions in the chat, and keep those coming because we're all trying to wrap our heads around this I'm thinking maybe I should have paid more attention in econ back in back in the day.
And let me say, this is a very complicated program. It is very complicated for the average citizen, even one of a concerned citizen who's perfectly intelligent, to wrap their head around. I've had numerous conversations with people, and they're sort of give you the blank stare and say, can we talk about the Red Sox and the weather? This is just way too messy. And for the average legislator, it's a real challenge.
That's a really good reminder that this is complicated, and everybody's trying to, we're trying to do our best here, right? We want to figure out how to strike that balance, and what are the strategic guardrails on the program that make it so consumers can participate, that support solar development, and that limit that upward pressure on rates. Because if I'm understanding correctly, that subsidy, that 15-cent discrepancy, folks who are part of the solar program or have bought into community solar they're getting that. Folks who aren't are going to have to pay it.
Well, the people who participate in the program, their share of the subsidy is about equal to the upward pressure on all rates. So they're going to be coming out just about whole. They won't see huge savings from the program because they, like all ratepayers, will see some of it in their rates, but because they share directly in the subsidy, roughly most of them will come out even. It's the 95% that don't participate in the program that could see their CMP delivery rates go up as much as 30% once all the projects are built and online.
Okay. So that rate increase, as you talked about, it's not, we're not experiencing that yet, but when in a year or two, it could be as much as 30%.
Yes. And this is important because we have a lot of angst about high electricity prices right now. And I'm sorry to say, for the early indications are it's only going to get worse next winter. The war in Ukraine and the natural gas and the liquefied natural gas that is so critical to getting us through the coldest day of the winter are already, the prices are going up. And I don't want the solar industry to bear the brunt of the high energy electricity prices right now or next winter. That is not the result of this program. That is the result of natural gas and liquefied natural gas coming into, Canaport and Everett, where we need them on the coldest days of the winter. But roll the tape out another year or two, and if we have 750 new projects representing 1,500 megawatts of capacity or anything close to it coming into commercial operation, this program will have substantial upward effect on rates.
Thanks for that reminder that this is not, the solution is not, okay, well then let's not do community solar, right? Or let's not do solar at all. Like, that's not what you're saying. it's that we've got
Solar is critical to getting us off of natural gas, not just because of the environmental benefits and climate change, but also because the pain that we have suffered as we watch the world energy markets work to our disadvantage. And we just know that we've got to, 50% of the electricity in New England is generated from natural gas. We are hostage to the price of natural gas, and it is going up and up and up.
So in the not very long term, because we need to move fast here, but one way it seems out of this quandary is to change that mix of how electricity is generated system-wide, right? If there's more solar on the grid, then I, as a consumer, can just flip the switch and know that I'm getting solar without having enrolled in a separate program to say I want solar.
Yeah, we need a lot more of the 5-cent solar. That's the stuff we need. And that will offset natural gas. That will force the natural gas generators to back off, and it will stop the price of the upward pressure of natural gas. The problem with this program is it just mirrors natural gas. If natural gas prices up the price of CMP's electricity, then the subsidy goes up to the solar developer, and then that subsidy gets brought back into the rates, and the rates go up again, and the subsidy goes up again. It's a vicious cycle with natural gas playing a role in it. And what we need is the solar industry to come forward with a lot more of the 5-cent solar that will solve both our economic problems and our environmental problems. And the more of that we can get, the better.
Whew. I am so grateful to you for walking us through this, because we've got a lot of we're all trying to figure it out. And thank you everybody who's putting questions in the chat, because you're really helping me figure out how to phrase these questions that we're all working through. Couple of things. Is the short-term takeaway that we should all rush out and buy into this program so that we are the consumers who are coming out whole in the end?
Yeah, I think that's a fair takeaway. Subject to those caveats I said at the end about, be careful. Not all of these marketers, and remember, it's not just the solar developers you're dealing with. They subcontract out the marketing, and we have seen some anecdotal evidence of stuff that is a little bit shady. So just be careful. But yes, I think, Kathleen, you're right. One way to protect your CMP bill is to participate in this program, because the participating ratepayers are going to be much better off than the non-participating.
And as we're making those decisions then about which program, I really appreciate that that advice and just how, what we need to be looking for. Does the location of a particular project matter? Like if I can buy into a program that's down the street instead of in Jackman, does that help?
Not under the current plan, anywhere in the service territory. So if it's in CMP service territory, if you're CMP ratepayer, and if you're a Versant ratepayer in Versant's territory, there is that one twist in this latest legislation that projects that are 50% co-located get the higher subsidy. But that's really not a concern of the ratepayer, other than making sure that when you sign up for a developer, that it is getting the full subsidy and isn't getting a reduced subsidy because of it fell behind on certain milestones.
Okay, so one of the strategic guardrails that you're suggesting could help in this next round of legislation would address location, though, right?
Well, that's one possibility as we look down the road. And look at the the DG 2.0. What we said is 2019. If someone's going to put a solar panel on their roof, that's fine. That is great, and we'll give you the full subsidy of that. Those are small projects, and they're perfectly appropriate. If it's something bigger than that, then what we want is developers to come forward with those projects and engage in competitive bidding, and so we can tease out those 5-cent kilowatt-hour projects that we can sign up and get signed up, and leave the participating ratepayer out of it. Make it just between the solar developer and CMP, get the competitive bidding done, get them signed up. And at that point, it doesn't matter how big the project is or where it's located, subject, of course, to CMP's ability to interconnect, a whole nother discussion. But essentially, we want big projects if they can interconnect at the 5-cent per kilowatt hour rate.
And how do we get more of that big commercial solar online?
Have the legislature pass legislation authorizing the PUC to do more competitive bidding. They have done some. There was a bill that didn't make it through this last spring that some of us were wished it had. Right now, the PUC is tied up with the Northern Maine competitive bidding, which is a form of, that is renewable power. It's located in Northern Maine. And hopefully those bids, when they're open, will be looking at power that is more in the 5-cent range than in the 20-cent range. So that project is going forward. And some people felt the PUC should take a pause while we see how much renewable energy there is from wind and solar in northern Maine and how expensive that is under competitive bidding. But at the end of the day, we got to get the PUC back into competitive bidding and find those projects that can bring on the solar that will back down the natural gas generation and save the climate and lower our utility bills.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Thank you. And I think, when we were talking earlier about the location of a particular project and this sort of strange world that we find ourselves in, we've got a policy that says the solar project in your neighborhood is the same as the solar project that's 5 megawatts that's far away. One of the questions was, okay, so if we're talking about proximity and your proximity to the project, that could make it difficult for folks who live in more urban areas to opt into community solar. Is that right?
Sure. Every ratepayer has a different situation. A tenant is going to have a different situation than a homeowner. An urban dweller, a condominium owner is going to have, each one's going to be a little different. But if you're just talking about putting a few solar panels on the roof, most of the residential ratepayers are going to have some opportunity, particularly as the cost comes down of those panels. So I think that, yes, there are always going to be some folks who just can't participate in the program. And that's why I think, as I said earlier, the 1 megawatt, 1 mile could be a way that maybe if there's an opportunity within a mile of an urban dweller, they can get together with their neighbors and share in a truly neighborhood community solar project. But a lot more thought needs to go into that. It's a great question, Kathleen.
And of course, I just keep coming back to, we just have to make the whole grid greener. And that's the way that we make sure everybody participates in renewable energy, right? That it's not an individual choice, but that the whole system gets greener.
Right.
So folks are really, we've been trying to navigate all of this. I think we have a history in the last few years of really turning to some of our phenomenal homegrown solar companies for not just for solar panels, but for advice and policy positions. What do you see as your role as public advocate as Maine makes the necessary transition away from fossil fuels and can you play that role of giving us advice and policy positions?
I'm happy to try. I am absolutely happy to try. I will be the first to concede that I have a bias toward lower rates, and that's because the statute that the legislature passed has the public advocate as the ratepayer advocate. So I am looking out for ratepayers, particularly low-income ratepayers, urban ratepayers, those who might not be as able to participate in the program. But having said that, and as I said last winter when the legislature confirmed me to this position, I can't focus exclusively on rates. We have got to solve this climate change issue, and we need to bring on renewable. And you only need to look at what we're facing right now with natural gas. It is a disaster, and it's going to continue to be. So I want to bring on as much renewable as we can, but at as cost-effective way as we can. I'm looking very closely and working with the folks on the offshore wind. I'm hopeful and optimistic that we can bring on offshore wind that will provide large amounts of renewable energy to back out and shut down the natural gas generators. The northern Maine, they're talking about the largest transmission line we have in the state, a 345 kV line. That's a massive transmission line because they think there is that much potential for renewable energy, both wind and solar in northern Maine. So those are good things, and I'm all for them. And we need to work on those and bring them on as cost effectively as possible.
Thank you. Thank you for your advocacy and for all of this work. You know, I think many of the folks who are on the call today were involved in advocating for the bill, not this last session, but the year before, that added climate impacts to the statute that requires us to think about costs. So I appreciate you wrapping those all together to remind us that ratepayer costs absolutely matter. We cannot let our rates go up without any sort of thoughtfulness and
yeah. And one of the practical problems, I mean, this is a complicated maze. We need more electric vehicles and we need more heat pumps. That's electricity. We have to be careful that we don't let the price of electricity get so high that on the margin, people are saying, I don't know if I can afford to run an electric vehicle, a plug-in vehicle, or I can afford heat pumps. We need to get off of gasoline in our cars and heating oil in our homes. And one of the ways to do that is to keep electricity competitively priced.
Oof. So yeah, you're right. We got to do it all. We got to do it all. And as I have struggled a bit in this last hour to follow the economic policy and all of that, I am grateful for the expertise of lots of different people, including you, Bill, in moving this forward, because we all have our part to play for sure. And I'm just so grateful to you for spending this time with us, and to all of you for joining us today. This was a tough and a really important program. And so our call to action on this one is, if it was helpful to you, share it. If you asked a great question in the chat that I did not manage to get in, send it to me by email when you get that follow-up email this afternoon, and we'll follow up with Bill and get you an answer. And know that it's not just you. We are all struggling to make sense of this. And the folks that we elect this November, they'll be struggling to make sense of it too. And we will be calling on all of you to help us help us help them. So
Kathleen, thank you for having me on this. Thank you for Maine Conservation Voters for making this opportunity. And thank you to all of you who giving up your lunch hour to listen to me. I really appreciate it. And don't hesitate. You can go to Kathleen, but if you ever have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me in the Office of Public Advocate. I'm happy to try and help.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. I hope everybody has a phenomenal weekend. I do want to just let you know that we are going to take a break in August from our Lunch and Learns. We love this time together, and we love it even more when we all have a chance to go out and enjoy the Maine summer. We will see you in September, and keep the ideas coming. This program was a direct result of lots of your suggestions. So if you've got something else you want to know, we can help you out. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.